Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, I would like to talk about the foundation nubs. Now, we've talked about nubs on the walls and on certain bedrock elements, but I would like to focus in particular on these foundation nubs because I think more than anywhere else, it shows that the nubs can be more than just lifting bosses. Now, the nubs make sense for blocks higher up on the walls. You need to wrap rope around them and lift them up into place. But on these foundation blocks, you really wouldn't need to do that, and you would think they'd be the easiest to dress up after the building is done, and you could remove all of them. There are a lot of temples that still have all these foundation nubs. So I'd like to show you all a few examples, and we'll go over some new sites that we haven't seen yet, some sites that have slipped through the cracks, and then some older sites that we've already looked at, but we're going to look at them in more detail. But before we begin, I would like to share one of my friend's videos. Phil over at the Ancient Alternative View, he has a couple great videos on the nubs, the Ancient Stone Language and Stone Language Part 2. These would be a great introductory video for you guys, so you guys can see the kinds of different interpretations of the nubs we can talk about. We can talk about them as a language, we can talk about them as calendar systems with shadow play and certain lightings and certain days of the year looking at them. We can talk about them as coded braille-like messages. I think there's lots of different expressions of nubs, and each different expression has a unique answer to it. They're not all lifting bosses. The bedrock nubs, for example, these are obviously not lifting bosses, and when you see things like this, it makes you wonder, is things like the hitching post and other enshrined bedrock nubs at temples like Pisac, are these nubs as well? Are they like lingams from India? What could the nubs represent? What couldn't they represent? How much can you say with a nub or a protrusion, or just with the geometry of the stone? So we've got to open our mind to different possibilities here. There's way too many different odd, peculiar expressions of nubs to just call these things lifting bosses. And then another thing I've seen proposed right here, you can see at Machu Picchu and other Incan settled sites, you have protrusions used to hold thatched roofs down. Something like this. It's interesting. It makes sense. I could see that in some instances. But then in instances like this, what kind of roof's going back here? And we see lots of interior nubs, like here at Pisac, you only have a couple. Where's the rest of them? And what kind of roof would this hold down if it was holding down a roof? Just questionable configurations. And like I said, not many people know about this. The bedrock nub, it's enshrined. They have this wall that goes around it. This is a focal point of this site. Is this artifact or object like a lingam from India? And then you start to ask yourself just what could be considered a nub. What kind of stone protrusion could be classified as a nub? So links for Phillip's videos will be in the description, and let's begin the tour of our temples. We're starting in Bulgaria. We also have them in Turkey, Lebanon, Greece, and we're going to end in Italy. So Bulgaria was a recent find. We found them at the foundation. Found a few good photos. You can see them over on the left-hand side. Different shapes, right? You'll see some that are more elongated, rectangular. They taper maybe into square nubs. And then you'll see a lot of them over here. Hey, they're gone. They disappear. I have lots of angles that show on this right-hand side. There are none. It's as though there's a cluster of them over here on the left-hand side. Another angle, you can see they're very shallow. Another angle here, see down here, very shallow. And also we'll point out while we're here, look at all these very nicely chiseled out rows of holes, square holes. Another angle, and you can see they taper perhaps. They're from larger over here down to just this one here maybe, and no more after that. So why the variation here. If this is some kind of standard lifting technique, why are they not on any of these blocks? And they look pristine. They don't look like there's any evidence of broken off nubs. And we'll look closer at other angles to prove that. And by the way, these things, while we're looking at them, these are some kind of giant gutter system. There's a few pieces. The spouts are lions' heads, and I guess water or whatever was in here and would pour out the channels and out the lions' mouths. Here you go. Here's another angle of those. You can see the beveling, and then these very nicely carved lion's heads. Very, very good. And the nubs over here in the corner, looking down. You can see their shallow profile, and you can see what they look like when they start to break off. One more really good detailed photo here where you can see the rounded profile and how shallow some of them are and what they look like when they break off. And here's the middle section, and you can see that there are no nubs. It's all pristine surfaces on these blocks. Another really good quality photo, zoomed way in. You can see most of these surfaces are pristine. There's maybe some slight imperfections, impressions, slight nubs perhaps down here, but for the most part, these are all pristine surfaces. They don't look to have ever had nubs on them. You can zoom out and see all these blocks the same way. And this interesting row of square holes again. We see that in larger square holes as attachment points for coping stones and lintels and other interesting decoration. These are very odd. They're smaller than those. Looking down, you can see on the left-hand side, mostly pristine surfaces here. I don't really see any traces of any nubs. They're all concentrated over on that one side. And while we're here, I'll point out this one other interesting artifact in the stone. This looks like an inverted nub. It's a very shallow square hole or depression. So what would connect to that if it was an attachment point or something? Looks more like an inverted form of a nub. And now we're going to go over to the Athena temple in Assos, Turkey. We've looked at this before. You can see these nubs down here at the bottom. We'll zoom in. Different shapes. Rounded, rectangle, like a pill shape or lozenge shape maybe. And then we have more geometric. We have a sharper top and bottom edge, but still rounded. This one's more pointed or pyramidal. Maybe this one as well, broken off. And then this one's a little more square. And then maybe some of the classic rounded top with flat bottom expression. So lots of variations here in these shapes. Another really good angle and lighting. You can see the rounded profile of this one. This one's shallower, smaller, maybe broken off, but has the rounded top, flat bottom. We'll zoom in a little more. You can see they vary in their placement and height. They go up and down a little bit, rounded and more geometric next to each other. Some of them pairs like this seem to be the same, but a little bit off in height. Very interesting though, lots of different expressions. Down here though, they kind of fade away. Like we pointed out in the older video, there aren't any on the lower, but there are a couple. And they're very faint or not very well formed. And it seems to go like this all the way around the temple, around the foundations. And you can see there's a variation. This is the classic one, the rounded top and flat bottom. We see this globally, it seems. And then other expressions. Pairs versus single nubs. Note that. And of course, the upper stones, more than likely modern replacements. That's why they don't have nubs. But I won't rule out that they could be ancient, though. They still look to be about the same color, so that's open for speculation. But I would like to remind everybody that there are instances of where modern restores fake or copy the older blocks, and it can look very convincing. So you just have to keep that in mind. A lot of these top courses of sites, if they look really good compared to the lower blocks, you got to assume that someone's come along at some point and fixed up the structures. So looking again, you can see how weathered the corners are on these lower blocks compared to the nice pristine corners of the upper blocks. Almost, I don't see almost any damage, maybe a little bit down here. So who knows? Could be modern replacements, more recent replacements. And then Hierapolis in Denizli, Turkey. Now this site is a new find, and it was in a place that I wasn't thinking to look. I've looked at amphitheaters for bevel blocks, and I have a few examples in my bevel block series of certain exterior walls that have bevels on them, but I didn't consider that this site might have bevels. I found bevels and nubs. I can't believe I missed it the first time around. It also has stone boxes with nubs. These we can look at and say maybe they are lifting bosses. Here the boss is on the box itself though, not on the lid. They all seem to be like that. And some of these boxes are perched up high on platforms. And like Phil pointed out, those look a lot like Xanthos. Xanthos has a lot of boxes and weird constructions on top of pillars and podiums like this. Here's one up on top of a gate. I don't know how it got up there, if that was the original intention or a later recycling. You can see a side profile of some of these lids. They have the side bosses on them for lifting. We see that expression in Egypt. We also see that expression in Polynesia and Japan. So that expression seems to be a little bit more of a global phenomenon and global technique. And note the lid shapes too. The lid shapes appear to be rounded, arch-topped, with these protruding bits on all four corners. You'll see a lot of variations of this around this area, and in Egypt there's kind of different versions of this as well, and those expressions I call bed frame sarcophagi lids. They have the square ends, and then the middle portions are rounded. Here you can see this box has no nub on the box itself. It does have one on the lid though. It'd be okay for lifting from, I suppose. It's that classic shape, that rounded top with the flat bottom, and then these more square side nubs. Another angle of one you can see is actually a flat profile, but the nub, the remnant there, a little more square like the side nubs. And then looking around, I started to see other structures that looked familiar. Some of these big chunky, almost bevel blocks with square holes at corners and perhaps some filler stones in places. And something I noticed from one of our earlier sites, there's lots of little tiny holes, I think these might be square holes, all inside the arch, the little niche here and down around the bottom. Then I saw the exterior of the amphitheater and I was blown away. Look at this. I'd never been shown this before, I'd never seen this before. For some reason, on the corner, there's a cluster of nubs. We don't see them anywhere else in the surrounding structure. They're only here on this corner. And some of them are darker than the blocks. They look like inclusions almost, like the Nubian pyramids, but they might just be darkened patches of stone of the same material as the blocks. Interesting variations in sizes and placements. This block down here, for example, has 3. 1, 2, 3. You don't need 3 bosses for lifting, and this smaller one in the middle. Going up the wall, you can see other variations. One small one here. None up at the top. If they are down here, why are they not at the top? These blocks, same color, same quality, same fitment. Why do they not have the nubs or any even broken off? That looks like pristine surfaces to me. They don't look like there's any broken off. Very odd expressions of these nubs. Some of them, even down here, do not have the nubs on them. You see broken areas. Maybe they've been broken off over here. If these are inclusions, these holes and voids, that could make sense if there was another rounded block, one of these inclusions in there. But for the most part, I think this is the same material as the blocks. At least that's what it looks like on the right-hand side. Here's another angle. You can see where we were over on the right hand side, those darker nubs. Then you come over here, you'll notice the interior of this arch. The nubs disappear. I don't see any. Then over here, down at the bottom, you'll catch one down here, that classic shape, rounded top, flat bottom. It's the very bottom stone. None up here. Until you get to here, you see one faint one, or very eroded. And then you don't really see any more until you get up here, perhaps one right there. So there's definite concentration, a cluster over here on the right hand side. Very odd. And then a little fun fact about this site, it has something called a plutonium. And this is one of those underground chambers that emits gases, and the oracles would go in and gain wisdom and foresight and predictions from the gases. It has this little square tunnel that goes through and comes out the other side. Here you can see where it comes out the other side, and then this little bit more ornate entryway over here on the right. Here's a better angle at that, and surprisingly, no nubs in this foundation area or anywhere around here. And looking at it from the other direction, this may all be secondary construction here on the right hand side. Would like to point out a couple of odd stones, like these rectangular stones down here with these scoops in them. Kind of interesting compared to the rest of them. Some good fitment of those back in the back. And next we're going to go to Naya Temple in Zali, Lebanon. Now there's hardly any photos of this site, and I found just a bare minimum here. These are the best ones I could find. I found nubs at this temple. The blocks here look a lot like Baalbek blocks, bevel blocks, and you can see faint bevels, and we'll zoom in down here on the bottom right. You'll see a good example of a bevel block. It's kind of faint, but you can see the crisp margin line there. Then moving up the wall, you can see other instances of bevel blocks. These have a little bit more thin margins on them, but they're there. Others just flat profiles, no bevels, and then others down here with more of a bevel to them here. And you'll notice lots of instances of L-shaped blocks. This is an occurrence in India as well. L-shaped blocks. Blocks with missing corners. Over here as well, lots of missing corners. Here's another nice angle. You can see that L-shaped block. This is obvious L shape, but other more subtle blocks, missing corners, different beveling. Another one here, missing corner. And then you come around to the front of it. The front of the temple is right here to the left. And then over here on this side of it, you can see down at the base, there are some nubs. And these are some of the only ones on the temple. I couldn't find them around the other sides. These are very curious. They're very rounded, and some of them are very rectangular, but they're also very faint. And you can see how they taper and fade away. From this point on, you really don't see them. We can zoom in a little bit more. You can start to see the beveled edge as well on these blocks down here at the base. So a classic shape, just like Baalbek, which is in the region. If we find nubs here, I think there's a very good chance that if we dig down and expose the actual foundations at Baalbek, we might find nubs there as well. Here's a good angle of the front of the temple, and you can see why I think it looks like Baalbek a lot. It has this trapezoidal door, very ornate, the stepped incised motif, the beveling. You can see up at the top there is some sculpture, relief carvings, motifs there, interesting. And then up at the very top, very ornate column capital elements over here as well. And perhaps a different motif over here, or perhaps this temple is heavily rebuilt. We also have to consider that you see all the modern repair work in between the ancient blocks. Perhaps, yeah, see down here, this repair section, a lot of this likely restacked. Maybe not in its correct locations. Here you can see a person for scale and the size of those nubs. It's very curious, they're only right here, and there's only a few of them. They taper away. And next we're going to jump over to Saphir, Lebanon, nearby. Again, not very many photos, but there's a couple good ones. I couldn't find any instances of nubs at this site, but there's not much left of this site. Again, perhaps a lot of it's been rebuilt. But the style again is very similar to Naya and Baalbek, this trapezoidal door with the stepped in size motif. Obviously the same or a connected set of builders. Here you can see some interesting one-piece columns, and the construction technique very similar. You could almost mistake the one temple for the other. A nice overhead view, and from this angle you get to see the foundations a little bit. Now, like I said, I couldn't find any nubs here. Perhaps there are some. Perhaps they're just covered up by grasses and things like that, or broken off. You'd have to get closer, and there's not that many photos. But I want to point out something about this foundation that I found impressive, and we'll look at that in some other photos. So here you can see how far down they went with the foundations, several courses deep. And then this photo, which is my favorite photo, you can see they've interlocked these, stacked these together in a certain pattern. It's very impressive. And then we'll move over to Delphi in Greece, where there's a lot of impressive architecture, and we talked about this earlier, and we'll just go over it briefly again. You can see the foundations for this temple have nubs as well, and some of these blocks you can see have this inverted beveling. You can see the raised edge of material, and then the interior is recessed and pitted, kind of like an inversion of the bevel block, and then perhaps more of that going on down here, but clearly nubs on these foundation blocks. I really like this image because this shows how non-uniform they are. Do you see it right here? This one nub, no other nubs. So why did this one block require that nub? I think we would see more instances of them being broken off. Perhaps you could say there's some broken off here, but these other surfaces look pristine like before. Another angle looking down a little bit, you can see the nub down here at the bottom and more around the exterior foundations. Perhaps they're in the interior foundations as well. You can see the odd way they raised the floor, and then these columns, these Doric non-fluted columns, you could say maybe some of those had nubs in the past, but they're so eroded, any little bump on there, I don't want to go that far. I would just like to say that, you can look and see, maybe some do look compelling to you, and we can say that there were nubs on the column segments at the Athens Acropolis. We can look at those again, so we know that there's the possibility that they could have had nubs on them. And since this site clearly has nubs, I think you could make a good case for some of these little bumps, but I'm going to leave all that up to you. These are way too eroded for me to say anything conclusive. And here you go, farther over to the right angle, where you can see that nub from before. Maybe the one broken off one here on the end. That is what a broken off nub looks like. You have a little bit of material left over. It's going to show. These others don't seem to show. Maybe here, maybe that's been smoothed off, right? Next to it, not really. This seems more of like the bevel. You can see the change in the surface texturing. This more pitted versus this smoother. It's odd though, the way the nubs appear and don't appear. And then there's this wall, of course, which is one of my favorites. The texturing is amazing. I don't know what's going on. It looks exactly like the Arcadia gate over in Messini. And you'll notice there's a small corner filler stone right here. Another hallmark. And why again the nubs at the bottom and clustered, concentrated? Very strange. Different shapes, sizes. We'll jump over to Preen in Greece real quick at their amphitheater. And on the inside, bottom row, you'll see nubs peeking out on either side there. And then over here to the right, a couple more. But you can search this photo for a while, and you really won't find any in the upper levels. If they're for lifting, why the bottom, not the top? And then shout out Ziggy Dan again for this one. This is Megalopolis, Greece, their amphitheater. See all these amphitheater finds. We're going to have to start looking closer at all the amphitheaters. Horrible quality photos, but even from this, you can obviously tell there's nubs down here on these foundations. And then over here, perhaps a couple big ones. Another angle with different lighting, you can see that these over here on the left clearly are the same style, the same rounded top, flat bottom nub. Looking again at Athens real quick, the Acropolis, these blocks, these column drum segments up here, they have partial fluting on them, and you'll notice that some of them have nubs on them. So perhaps the Delphi column segments did as well. And then you'll look over here, like we saw before, other blocks with nubs. If you look around the Erechtheion, the temple just above, lots of nubs in this structure. So perhaps those column drum segments were part of this structure originally. Here I will say they could be for lifting bosses because they're on either side of the block, right? One for either side. Still kind of precarious. You see the variation. You see the variation in how much they protrude. Some of these, were they ever really there? Or is this a faint trace of a molding process? And this is as much of a nub as there ever was from the day it was made. Some of these are odd. It almost looks like a double registration, like two nubs, one on top of the other. Some of them pyramidal almost, very geometric. Some of them more rounded. But there's definitely a variation in size and placement. This one higher up, these lower down. And Phillip found this great angle just today, so I wanted to include this. You can see lots of variation, and like he pointed out, there are no nubs on the bottom courses. Very interesting. It's an inversion from all the other sites we've been looking at today. These don't have any on the bottom. But again, there's a variation in size, and they all appear close though. They appear all this kind of same rounded top, flat bottom. And I kind of pointed that out in another photo from the Acropolis, which was this photo here. They all appear to be kind of pyramidal, but rounded top, flat bottom. Kind of a standard shape, but this is the shape we see on the portcullis slab inside the Great Pyramid. And here's one of only a couple photos of that. And like we talked about before, around the base of the Khafre Pyramid. And just to drive the point home again, we can look at this area of the Coricancha in Peru. You can see we have the same variation. We have this rounded top, flat bottom. We have smaller geometric, more pyramidal ones, and smaller, cruder ones, elongated, rectangular ones. And as in other regions, why so sporadic? Down here on the outside, we were just up here on the inside. You can see these blocks down here have a couple of nubs. These two very small and faint close together. We'll zoom in on that. We really need to drive that point home because that's important. What are you going to lift with those two little nubs? These maybe, those no way. And why no other nubs? Look at the pristine surfaces. I don't see any broken off nubs, yet this is all original. You might be able to say some up at the top, and then when you move around to the other side, you'll have to ignore this top trim. That's an artist's rendition, depiction of what they think might have been there. But you can see over here there's a tiny cluster of nubs, very, very faint, almost impossible to see without the right lighting. That's why I like to use this photo despite that obvious fanciful top. Very interesting that none of the other blocks throughout the whole construction have any nubs or any traces of nubs. So then we'll close it up today with the Temple of Segesta, which is in Sicily. And we've looked at this earlier in my bevel block series. This was one I couldn't miss with nubs the first time I saw it. I wasn't looking for nubs, but you can't miss them once you looked around the temple a couple times. They're all the way around the base. And again, like at Athens, we could say this is kind of a uniform, standardized expression. They're on almost, every single block in the same configuration. Maybe some variations here at the ends, like none there. But for the most part, they all look to be about the same size. But I do see some different variations in their shapes. A rounded top, flat bottom, and some other more pyramidal geometric shapes. Another more kind of distorted fisheye angle, but you can see how they go down the entire length of the base. Here's the front and a pretty good quality photo. You can see the variation. Now you can see this one's more elongated, like a rectangle, vertical rectangle. You can see a square one. Perhaps that one's more rounded, bigger, square. You can see the variation in their placement. Some are slightly higher, some are slightly lower. And then of course below that you do not see any. Over here on the left, the lower part, you do not see any. And then here's a really cool close-up. You can see the beveling on these lower pedestals. You can see even on the rounded portions of some of the segments, they have the bevels. You can see what might be a small filler stone up here top right, like that. And these are pretty eroded, or just porous blocks, however you want to describe that. And you can see the nubs here a little closer, even though it's kind of hard to distinguish them. The smaller one here, the more rectangular, a larger round one. It's too hard to make out any others. Maybe one here and one here, but they're very faint, right? And then finally I just found this cool illustration. It's actually pretty accurate for an illustration. It shows, just like kind of in Piranesi's illustrations of Italy and Rome, you can see these protrusions on the base. I think it's very, very interesting. You can see that those people for scale, that's pretty much the correct scale as well. And I don't like to include actual people in my photos when I can help it, just because of licensing and all that. But you can see that's a very large temple, and there's a few others in Italy like this. Here at Paestum in Italy, very close, very similar design. Other temples in Italy, very similar design, even though these foundations are more worn or cruder. It's hard to make out if there were any. A lot of them have scratch marks on them. A good example of that is here at the Temple of Concordia, which is also in Italy. A lot of these you could really mistake one for the other, but these don't appear to have any nubs on them. They do have these scratch marks though. Interesting. Fluted columns versus non-fluted columns, but otherwise the triglyph seems to be a repeating motif at all these sites. But regardless, I think these foundation nubs have a little bit more to tell us if we look at them with a little bit more scrutiny. There's way too much variation, and even if you want to say they're lifting bosses, we just went all around the world with these. So how is it such a global phenomenon, right down to the very same shape, the very same expressions, the same variations? So I'd love to hear your all's comments and opinions, and look forward to the Nubs of India video out hopefully soon. We're going to start working on it. We might have found another temple today. I'll have to look into that, but we're going to try to get out at least part 1 of that in the next few days. So thank you guys for hanging out with me, and we will talk to you next time.